My name is David Hood, and I help give pastoral leadership to Southeast City Church. And if you don't know, Southeast City Church is a relatively young church in Ottawa. We've been around for about 6 years, and we want to be a church that, gathered or scattered, is a family of servants on mission for our city with Jesus at the center, because we really do believe that Jesus makes all the difference. He is the hope of the world and every individual in it. He's the hope of our city and every individual in it. And so everything we do, we want it to be because of Jesus and for Jesus and through Jesus. And we meet every Sunday for singing and formative teaching and prayer and communion, and then we scatter throughout the week into family gatherings, which are groups that meet for mutual learning around scripture and midweek connection and deep prayer for our church, city, and world. We scatter into going deeper groups, which are small, same gender groups that create space for greater vulnerability and accountability and mutual discipleship and prayer. And we also scatter into various outreaches, especially to people in our neighborhood that are experiencing isolation and marginalization due to poverty and homelessness and addictions and mental illness and trauma. We have a food bank every Monday evening. I am very grateful that for 4 years we have never missed a night helping our neighbors who are experiencing food insecurity. We also have a prayer outreach where we gather with our neighbors in community housing and we check in and ask them how they're doing, and we encourage each other and talk about faith and life together, and we pray for each other. So we are very invested in our neighborhood and our city, and we're very active, and we love people, and we want people to know the Jesus that we love. And what you are about to watch is a recording of our teaching from this past Sunday. And I really sincerely pray that wherever you are on your spiritual journey, maybe you're a total skeptic, maybe you've been following Jesus for years, I pray that wherever you are on your journey, this teaching would meet you where you're at and would minister to you and encourage you and help you. If you have any questions about the teaching, or if you want prayer for anything, or if you just want to get to know us, I would encourage you to go to southeastcitychurch.ca. You can watch past teachings there, learn all about us, and you can also reach out to us through our contact page. That's where you can leave prayer requests and ask questions, and so I would encourage you to go there, and I assure you that if you reach out to us, somebody will reach back out to you. I'd also really encourage you to join us in person sometime on a Sunday. We meet at the Martin Luther Church, 933 Smythe Road at 4 p.m. every Sunday, unless otherwise indicated on our website or social media, but we're pretty much always there, and we would love to have you join us face-to-face and shoulder-to-shoulder as we learn about Jesus and his way together. It doesn't matter who you are or where you've been or what you've done or whether you believe or not, there is a space available for everybody at our table, and everybody that's with us is community and family, and we are committed to journeying together. So we would love to see you there. Yeah, I hope that this teaching encourages you, and I hope to see you or hear from you soon. Blessings. All right, we are looking at the book of Judges right now as a church. So if you're new, you're probably like, what have I gotten myself into? We call it the dark, strange, violent world of Judges, and that's what it is in many ways. But so far, I've found this series to be, while difficult, a tremendous blessing at the same time. And I just want to draw your attention, if you want to listen to past teachings on this book, we've got a YouTube channel. You can go to Facebook as well. It's all there. Everything's uploaded to our website, and there is also a podcast that you can subscribe to on Google, Spotify, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. So there's really no reason to not be able to catch up on the teachings if you want to. And also in your programs that Nicole gave you at the back, there are often additional resources. So if you want to learn more about what we're talking about, we've got recommended additional resources there. And we also have a further up and further in, which is almost like homework, but it's devotional homework, a chance for you to go deeper with the teaching in your own devotional life during the week. So we are going to be in chapter 10 of Judges, chapter 10, and starting at verse 6. The text is up there on the screen. There's also Bibles at the back if you want. Then the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They worshipped the Baals and the Ashtoreths, the gods of Aram, Sidon, and Moab, and the gods of the Ammonites and the Philistines. They abandoned Yahweh and did not worship him. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he sold them to the Philistines and the Ammonites. They shattered and crushed the Israelites that year, and for 18 years they did the same to all the Israelites who were on the other side of the Jordan in the land of the Amorites in Gilead. The Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah, Benjamin, and the house of Ephraim. Israel was greatly oppressed, so they cried out to the Lord, saying, "We have sinned against you. We have abandoned our God and worshipped the Baals." And the Lord said to the Israelites, "When the Egyptians, Amorites, Ammonites, Philistines, Sidonians, Amalekites, and Maonites oppressed you, and you cried out to me, did I not deliver you from their power? But you have abandoned me and worshipped other gods. Therefore I will not deliver you again. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them deliver you in the time of your oppression." But the Israelites said, "We have sinned. Deal with us as you see fit. Only deliver us today." So they got rid of the foreign gods among them and worshipped the Lord, and he became weary of Israel's misery. And the Ammonites were called together, and they camped in Gilead. So the Israelites assembled and camped at Mizpah. And the rulers of Gilead said to one another, "Which man will lead the fight against the Ammonites? He will be the leader of all the inhabitants of Gilead." So the story today starts off in the way that many of the stories have started off in this book. There is a cycle that we see in this book over and over and over again. God is attempting to bless his people. He's attempting to bless them with his love and with his presence and with abundance and prosperity. And they keep imagining that God is not all that good, and God is not all that trustworthy, and that God is holding out on them, and there are better things in the nations around them, better things that the other gods have to offer. And so they keep rebelling against Yahweh and running away from Yahweh and serving all of these other gods, and they end up in all kinds of destructive habits and practices, and they get spiritually enslaved, and they hurt themselves, and they hurt each other, and they hurt the creation, and God eventually says enough is enough. And what he does is he lifts his protective blessing, his protective cover over them, and allows them to be invaded by these nations. Now, remember, these are the nations that they're emulating. These are the nations that they want to be like. And God just allows them to invade them. And they oppress them, and the Israelites realize these nations are not all that great, and these gods are not all that great. And they start to cry out to Yahweh again, "Save us, deliver us." And Yahweh does time and time again, and then once there's peace, the cycle repeats itself. And that's what we're seeing today. And I love that in this passage, Yahweh actually says to them, "Why don't you cry out to the other gods?" Right? These other gods that you've been worshiping, why don't you ask them for help? Why don't you ask them for salvation? Now, of course, these gods can't see, they can't hear, they can't act, they can't save. And the Israelites know this. At one level, they know it. And they say, "God, deal with us however you see fit in the future, but deliver us today." Deliver us today. And God relents, as he often does. And so he's going to raise up a judge, a deliverer, a rescuer to help Israel again. And so then we jump down to chapter 11 and verse 1, and it says, "Jephthah the Gileadite was a great warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute, and Gilead was his father. And Gilead's wife bore him sons, and when they grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, 'You will have no inheritance in our father's house, because you are the son of another woman.' So Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Then some lawless men joined Jephthah and traveled with him. Sometime later, the Ammonites fought against Israel, and when the Ammonites made war with Israel, the elders of Gilead went to Jephthah to get him from the land of Tob. And they said to him, 'Come, be our commander, and let's fight against the Ammonites.' And Jephthah replied to the elders of Gilead, 'Didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why then have you come to me now when you're in trouble?' And they answered Jephthah, 'Since that's true, we now turn to you. Come with us. Fight the Ammonites, and you will become leader of all the inhabitants of Gilead." So Jephthah said to them, "If you are bringing me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me, I will be your leader." And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "The Lord is our witness if we don't do as you say." So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people put him over themselves as leader and commander, and Jephthah repeated all his terms in the presence of the Lord at Mizpah. The judge, the deliverer, the rescuer today is Jephthah. And we are introduced to him. He's the son of a prostitute, the son of Gilead. And Gilead has many sons by his wife, and those sons reject Jephthah. They say to Jephthah, "You're not really one of us. Yes, we have the same father, but you're from a different mother. You're from a mother of ill repute. We don't recognize you. We don't want you around. We're not interested in sharing our inheritance and our family story with you." And they kick him out, and he goes wandering around, and he comes into relationship with some unsavory types. And they go around doing some not so good things together, kind of like a gang, a little West Side Story going on, right? Jephthah's not a good guy, and he's with lawless people. But in the process, he becomes a warrior, and he gets a reputation. He's a good fighter. He's a good scrapper. And once again, Israel's been invaded, and Israel comes to him, and Israel says, "Would you be willing to fight for us, to be our judge?" And Jephthah says to them, "Didn't you kick me out? Didn't you want nothing to do with me?" And they say, "Listen, if you come back, you can be our leader. If you come back, you can be king, and you'll get all the glory." And he says, "All right, I'll come back." That sounds like a pretty good deal. Now, we can't get into all of the details of Jephthah's story. I really just want to look at one particular story in Jephthah's story. So we're going to jump down to verse 29, where it says, "The Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah, who traveled through Gilead and Manasseh, and then through Mizpah of Gilead. And he crossed over to the Ammonites from Mizpah of Gilead. And Jephthah made this vow to the Lord: 'If you will hand over the Ammonites to me, whatever comes out of the doors of my house to greet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites will belong to the Lord, and I will offer it as a burnt offering.' And Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord handed them over to him, and he defeated 20 of their cities with a great slaughter, all the way to the entrance of Minnith and Abel-keramim. So the Ammonites were subdued before the Israelites. And when Jephthah went to his home in Mizpah, there was his daughter, coming out to meet him with tambourines and dancing. And she was his only child. He had no other son or daughter besides her. And when he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, 'No, not my daughter. You have devastated me. You have brought great misery on me. I have given my word to the Lord and cannot take it back.' And then she said to him, 'My father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you have said. For the Lord brought vengeance on your enemies, the Ammonites.' She also said to her father, 'Let me do this one thing. Let me wander 2 months through the mountains with my friends and mourn my virginity.' 'Go,' he said. And he sent her away 2 months. So she left with her friends and mourned her virginity as she wandered through the mountains. And at the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, and he kept the vow he had made about her. And she had never been intimate with a man. Now it became a custom in Israel that 4 days each year the young women of Israel would commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite." This is a heavy story. Jephthah prepares for war with the Ammonites by vowing to God that if God gives him the victory, whatever first comes out his door when he gets home, he will give to God and offer as a burnt sacrifice. And he is utterly devastated when what, or rather who, comes out of his house is his beloved daughter, his one and only child. She comes out dancing to welcome her father home and celebrate his victory, and Jephthah can't believe it. He's stunned, he's speechless, he's gutted. He breaks down and tells his daughter what he vowed, and incredibly, she tells him to go ahead and do it. She says, "If you made a vow to Yahweh and he kept up his end, you have to keep up your end." And so Jephthah does, and we simply read, he kept the vow he had made about her. The end. For many, this is one of the most disturbing and upsetting stories in the Old Testament, and it is extremely difficult to know what exactly we're supposed to get from this as followers of Jesus. The lesson that is often drawn out, or that I've heard often drawn out from this story, is don't make hasty vows. Don't make rash vows. Think about the vows that you're going to make. You might come to regret it if you're too hasty, but to me this seems like a extremely, if I can put it delicately and reverently, an extremely disturbing way for God to teach this lesson. It seems like an odd way for God to be like, you really should have thought about that, shouldn't you have, Jephthah? I don't know if that's the lesson we're supposed to get from this. I've long wrestled with this story and what it means. But as I was reading about this story and reading a variety of different commentaries and essays on it, I would suggest that there isn't one way of reading this story. While the story isn't entirely clear, there are hints in the text that suggest the possibility, perhaps strongly suggest the possibility, that Jephthah didn't actually sacrifice his daughter as a burnt offering. Now, he and she gave up something, but it wasn't her life on an altar. Now, here's the thing. I don't know if what I'm about to share is absolutely the correct interpretation. I don't know if we're going to know this side of heaven exactly for sure what happened in this story, but I want to suggest an alternate reading of Jephthah's story. Why do I think it's possible that Jephthah didn't sacrifice his daughter on an altar? Well, number one, if Jephthah's vow to Yahweh involved the very real possibility of human sacrifice and child sacrifice, why would God associate himself with it? Yahweh is everywhere in the Old Testament opposed to human sacrifice, and especially opposed to child sacrifice. It's one of the key distinguishing features of God. It's one of the things that sets God apart from the gods of the nations, the violent and malevolent gods of Canaan. And it's actually one of the reasons that Yahweh states, one of the reasons he's judging those nations. One of the reasons he's driving them out and using Israel to judge them. Leviticus 18:21 says, "You are not to make any of your children pass through the fire to Molech. Do not profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh." Leviticus 20:1-5, the Lord spoke to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, any Israelite or foreigner living in Israel who gives any of his children to Molech must be put to death. The people of the country are to stone him. I will turn against that man and cut him off from his people, because he gave his offspring to Molech, defiling my sanctuary and profaning my holy name. But if the people of the country look the other way when that man gives any of his children to Molech and do not put him to death, then I will turn against that man and his family and cut off from their people both him and all who follow him." Deuteronomy 12:29-32 says, "When the Lord your God drives out the nations before you, which you are entering to take possession of, and you drive them out and live in their land, be careful not to be ensnared by their ways after they have been destroyed before you. Do not inquire about their gods, asking, 'How did these nations worship their gods? I'll also do the same.' You must not do the same to the Lord your God, because they practice every detestable thing which the Lord hates for their gods. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. You must be careful to do everything I command you. Do not add anything to it or take away from it." And then Deuteronomy 18:9-14. "When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not imitate the detestable customs of those nations. No one among you is to make his son or daughter pass through the fire. Everyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord, and the Lord your God is driving out the nations before you because of these detestable things. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. Though these nations you are about to drive out do these things, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do this. All right, these are just a few examples, but it's everywhere that child sacrifice in the strongest possible terms is an abomination to God. He hates it. It's evil. It's demonic. It's from the pit of hell. It's antichrist. And in the one story where it looks like God might be expecting child sacrifice, the story of Abraham and Isaac, if you know the story, Isaac is on the altar and Abraham's about to go through with sacrificing him, and God intervenes and says, "No, I don't actually want you to do this. I don't actually expect this of you." He intervenes to stop it. And so if God is omniscient, he knows everything, and I believe he is, he would have known that Jephthah's vow, if he was victorious, would result in the sacrifice of his daughter. Why then would God give Jephthah victory over the Ammonites? Why would God honor this vow? Why would he allow Jephthah's daughter to come out the door first? Why, like Abraham, would he not intervene to stop the sacrifice and save, in many ways, his reputation among the nations? Now, we might say, well, hang on, God has other commands as well. In Numbers chapter 30, this is what the Lord has commanded. When a man makes a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to put himself under an obligation, he must not break his word. He must do whatever he has promised. And obviously, Jephthah takes that seriously. So we might say God just wants him to follow through because that's another one of his commandments. If you make a vow, you keep that vow. But it doesn't make sense that God would expect Jephthah to keep this command by doing something utterly horrific, something that God is explicit everywhere is detestable to him, utterly detestable to him. Now, we've already seen in the book of Judges that, yes, God uses human evil towards his good, righteous ends and wills his good purposes in our willful evil. We've seen that God sometimes accommodates evil, but the evil in this story serves no purpose, and it actually makes Yahweh look like the gods of the nations around Israel. The story would have become after this that Yahweh is exactly like Molech. He's exactly like Shemosh and Milcom and Baal. The story would become Yahweh made Jephthah sacrifice his child to him as payment for giving him victory over the Ammonites. Yahweh wants child sacrifice. If you want victory in your life, then sacrifice your kids. That would have been the story. And it doesn't make sense for God to associate with that. Second reason, I offer an alternate reading. Jephthah's daughter's reaction to his vow, when Jephthah shares with her what he vowed, her reaction is she asks for time and space to mourn the fact that she won't get married and she won't have kids. Right? Verse 38, let me do this one thing. Let me wander 2 months through the mountains with my friends and mourn my virginity. Go, he said, and he sent her away 2 months. So she left with her friends and mourned her virginity as she wandered through the mountains. And at the end of the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he kept the vow he had made about her, and she had never been intimate with a man. It seems odd that she and her friends spent a prolonged period of time specifically mourning her singleness and her childlessness and not her impending death. It also seems odd that the most notable thing about Jephthah's following through with the vow is that because of it, she never married. Like, that's the final statement. Jephthah kept his vow, and she never got married. It's not he kept his vow and she died. It's he kept his vow and she never got married. The emphasis is heavily throughout the story on her not getting married and her not having kids. That seems to be the biggest deal in Jephthah's vow. And apparently, I'm not a Hebrew expert, but there are many who are. Apparently, there is some ambiguity in the Hebrew that would allow the phrase, it became a custom in Israel that 4 days each year the young women of Israel would commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. It's possible for that to mean that they didn't commemorate her, but they commemorated with her. In other words, they spoke to her and commiserated with her, implying that she's still alive. And a support for this translation is the fact that we never hear of this custom again, right? If the custom was to commemorate her sacrifice, that would be ongoing, year after year after year after year after year. You'd think we would hear about it again somewhere in the Hebrew Scriptures. But if the custom was to lament her loss of a future, so to speak, it would end when she did eventually die. If they were mourning with her while she's alive, eventually when she passed, this custom would be over. And then the third thing, if I can offer an alternate reading, the third thing is the wording of Jephthah's vow. It says in verse 30, "If you will hand over the Ammonites to me, whatever comes out of the doors of my house to greet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites will belong to the Lord, and I will offer it as a burnt offering." It almost feels like he's making two vows. He could have just said, "Whatever comes out the doors of my house to greet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites, I will dedicate or I will offer as a burnt offering." But instead he says, "I will dedicate it and I will offer it as a burnt offering." He makes a pledge of dedication and a pledge of sacrifice. And because of this, some have noted that the flexibility of the conjunctive, for those of you that like language, the flexibility of the conjunctive linking the two statements, it could be read as "and," I will dedicate and sacrifice, but it could also be read as "or," so that whatever or whoever came out would be dedicated to God in some way, and should it prove appropriate, it would be sacrificed. Now, there's considerable debate about this translation, and I can't settle that today. But it makes sense to me because not everything that could possibly have come out of Jephthah's door could be sacrificed. Right? One of the keys when it came to sacrificing to Yahweh, one of the keys was that the animal had to be unblemished. It had to be whole. It had to be perfect. Jephthah couldn't guarantee that a perfect animal would come out to greet him when he got home. What if it was janky goat Tom, right? Coming out with 3 legs and flies around his eyes, and it's like, I can't offer this to God for victory over the Ammonites, right? It can't just go without saying that whatever came out would be appropriate for a sacrifice. It wouldn't be. So it makes more sense that Jephthah's vow is to set apart for God whatever or whoever comes out of his house, and if he can, he'll sacrifice it. But either way, something of his will belong to God if God gives him the victory. And his daughter comes out. And child sacrifice is unacceptable and condemned, as we've seen, and so Jephthah dedicates her to Yahweh. She gives up the prospect of marriage and children to serve the Lord, possibly at the tabernacle, all the days of her life. And we might say, well, why was Jephthah so devastated? Why was he so gutted? Well, because this was a big deal in these days. And this daughter of his, we're told, was his only daughter, his only child, actually. In other words, if she's dedicated to the Lord and never marries and never has kids, then his line ends. He has no offspring. He has no legacy, which in this culture was a big deal. Tim Keller, now he's talking about Greco-Roman cultures, but it's the same in many ways in the ancient Near East. He says nearly all ancient religions and cultures made an absolute value of the family and of the bearing of children. There was no honor without family honor, and there was no real lasting significance or legacy without leaving heirs. Without children, you essentially vanished. You had no future. Long-term single adults were considered to be living a human life that was less than fully realized. And so in Jephthah's culture, this was a significant sacrifice that Jephthah and his daughter made. It was a sacrifice, just not a sacrifice of her life. And if this is true, and I'm persuaded that it very much could be, then Jephthah's vow wasn't as rash or as outrightly pagan as we often assume, but it was nevertheless a very costly vow. and probably one that he didn't really entirely think through the implications of when he made it. Now, the reality is that it is entirely possible that Jephthah did indeed sacrifice his daughter. All right, I'm not saying this is the interpretation, dogma pronounced from the front of Southeast City Church. Do not disagree with me. I'm not saying that, right? It's entirely possible that Jephthah did sacrifice his daughter. If that is the case, I want to be absolutely abundantly clear that if he did that, that had nothing to do with Yahweh. I hope we saw in those verses in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, that if Jephthah pledged this, that was his own pledge, and if he did that, that was his own evil. God would never expect that, require that, want that. Indeed, it's detestable to him. But I'm going to go with he didn't actually do it. And if that's the case, then what do we learn from this story? What do we learn from this story? And we have to cross a bit of a bridge, like I talked about before, from Judges to our life in the here and now. We can't just directly apply Judges to our life in 21st century Ottawa, but not just because it's a different culture, but because we're also at a different time in redemptive history. Jesus has come. We're in a new covenant. We're not under the Mosaic law. If you want to know what I'm talking about, you can go back to sermon number 1 where I unpack that a bit more. But what do we learn as followers of Jesus this side of the cross and resurrection? What do we learn from this story? Number 1, God promises us victory, but experiencing victory in our lives is going to cost us. God promises us all, as followers of Jesus, victory, but experiencing that victory in our lives is going to cost us. Now, unlike the Israelites, our battle is not against nations, it's not against individuals, it's not against people groups. Our battle is against our own sin, our own broken, janky nature that wants to rebel against God. Our battle is against the world, and by that I don't mean the people in the world, but a system of ideas, values, morals, practices, and social norms that are integrated into the mainstream and institutionalized in a culture corrupted by our rebellion against God. That's what world means in New Testament when it talks about not being like the world and resisting the world. It's not rejecting people, it's rejecting sets of values that set themselves up against the values of God. And our battle is against the devil. So our sin, the world, and the devil. Essentially, our battle as followers of Jesus is to resist and put to death everything in us that is corrupt. Everything in us that's anti-Jesus, everything in us that's dark. Put these things to death and become every day, incrementally, step by step, more and more and more like Jesus. Jesus is who we want to become like. Jesus is the ultimate human, right? Jesus showed us the very best life to live. We are to become like Jesus, and we are to live like Jesus in the world, and we are to push back the darkness that we see in the world around us, not through swords and guns, or even, I would say, through courts and politics, but through prayer and through worship and through proclaiming the good news and the lordship of Jesus Christ and inviting people to believe, and service, loving the people around us, humbly entering into their lives and being the very best neighbors and the very best citizens. Service, proclamation, prayer, worship, and witness, showing through the quality of our common life together and our transformed lives what life lived under the rule of God looks like. That's how we push back the darkness. So we're dealing with the darkness, or Jesus is dealing with the darkness in us, and as he does that, we push back against the darkness in the world. Now here's the thing. You don't just automatically become like Jesus. And you don't just automatically live like Jesus in the world. You don't get to just sit in your lazy boy and expect to just become like Jesus. And when I get up out of this chair, I'm going to live like Jesus in the world. It doesn't happen like that, sadly. I would love for it to be that way, but it isn't that way. You don't just automatically overcome sin in your life. You don't just automatically get free from wounds and past hurts and family sin patterns and demonic strongholds. You don't just automatically see the kingdom come in your neighborhood, your workplace, your campus, your school, our city. We have to sacrifice for these things. It costs us. It has to cost us our time and our energy and our priorities and our plans and our dedication, our work. It's work to do these things. Prayer is work. Sitting at the feet of Jesus and being with him and letting him speak into our lives and change us. There's effort there. It's spirit-empowered effort. It's grace-fueled effort, but it's nevertheless effort. Obeying Jesus, even when we don't feel like it, there's effort. Serving, even when we don't feel like it, there's effort. Getting into community and being vulnerable, letting yourself be known, opening yourself up to other people. All of this takes effort. Now, it causes us to enter into the very best life possible with the very best King and Lord possible, but it's hard work. It's effort. The victories that God promises us, it costs us to experience those victories in our lives. The second thing that I want us to pull out from this story, and it might seem odd, but I hope it comes around. Your call, again, this is depending on a certain interpretation of the story, but your call might be to singleness and to childlessness. You might not get married, and you might not have kids, or you might be married and not have kids, or be married and not have biological kids. But unlike the culture of Jesus' day, and unlike the culture of Jephthah's day, it isn't a less than life in the economy of Jesus. In the New Testament, Jesus does something unbelievably radical. He praises marriage as wonderful and good, and it displays the gospel. But then he also elevates singleness, not just as if it happens like this, don't worry, it can be good too. No, he elevates singleness and celibacy as perfectly and equally legitimate states of being for his followers with a whole bunch of blessings of their own. I mean, the reality is that Jesus himself was single and celibate his whole life. And we would say that Jesus lived the most fulfilled human life that has ever been lived. So obviously, romantic love is not the only kind of love, and biological family is not the only kind of family. Jesus enjoyed love and family through his many deep friendships with both his male and female followers, and he says both states are good, and both states are gifts. Whatever state you are in, for however long you are in it, that is the gift of God. It is a gift of God for you. In the ancient world, Christianity was unique because there was actually a place for singleness. Singles declared that their hope was in God, their value and significance and meaning was in Jesus, their family was the family of God, their inheritance was the new heavens and new earth, and their legacy was a life lived for God and spiritual children nurtured in the faith, people that they had walked with towards faith in Jesus and then towards maturity in Jesus. Both states are good and both states are gifts, and God calls us to them. And then the last thing that I want us to pull out of this story. Why does God hate human child sacrifice? You might think, duh, Dave, because it's awful. Sure, there are many ways to answer this question, but I'm going to answer it in this way. The reason that God detests it is because it's us sacrificing someone else for our own salvation. We're saying, you're going to die, You, my offspring, or whatever, you're going to die so that I can earn the blessings and the favor and the love and the forgiveness of this deity. This is an affront to God, who doesn't want us to sacrifice others for our salvation. Why? Because he wants to sacrifice himself and has sacrificed himself for us. The reality is we are like the Israelites, right? I know I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. So often we read the Old Testament and we're just like, oh, Israel, you guys are so silly. I can't believe you keep messing up in this way. But we're exactly like them. We're exactly like them. We have gone astray. God wants to bless us. God wants to give us a life of forever love with him, and yet we doubt him, and we're running after sex and possessions and career success and the applause of others and power and fame as if these things are going to satisfy us and fill us up. Right? God's not enough, or God's holding out on me, or God doesn't want me to know that actually all these other things in the world can fill me up and satisfy me. And we run after these things, and these things end up enslaving us, and we don't enter into the fullness of the life that we were made for. And we hurt ourselves, and we hurt others, and we hurt the creation, and we're in debt to God, and we're under judgment for the things that we've done. And God looks at us like he looked at the Israelites, and he says to us, not, offer me your children, and maybe I'll spare you. He says, don't offer your children, because I will offer my child. I will offer my son for you. And in Jesus, God sacrificed himself for us when we were rebels against him. This sets God apart from all of the other gods. All of the other gods are up on top of a mountain. Do this, do that, and then maybe I'll bless you. God says, I will come down to you and sacrifice myself for you to bless you, to save you, to love you, to forgive you, to redeem you, to make you mine. I will do it for you. It's exactly what happens in the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham is about to sacrifice Isaac. God intervenes and says, don't do that, don't do that. Put the knife down. I don't actually expect that. And then Abraham and Isaac look over, and there's a ram, it says, caught in the thicket. And it's like God is saying, you don't have to sacrifice your child. I've got to sacrifice. I'll provide the sacrifice. It's not from you, it's from me. Other gods want us to sacrifice what's ours, and even our own kids, to get blessing. But God says, I will sacrifice myself to bless you. And this is why we now, if you're a follower of Jesus, this is why we now sacrifice our lives in so many ways, and why we dedicate ourselves to God, and we set ourselves apart, and we live for God in the world. It's not to earn the love and the blessing and the favor and the acceptance of God. I do all this so that hopefully someday God loves me. No, we do what we do because we are already loved by God. We're already blessed. We're already favored. We're already delighted in. And we respond to that. We want to please God, and we want to emulate God, and we want to devote ourselves to him and live into the blessing that he bought for us with his own blood. We don't do to be loved. We do because we are loved. And we are loved by a God who doesn't expect our sacrifice to be saved, but who sacrifices himself to save us when we don't deserve it, especially when we don't deserve it.